All right. So, as previously mentioned, my name is Brielle. I'm one of the advisors here at HPA. I'm also the director of the UC Davis Health Professions Postbac program. So, I tend to work with a lot of students who have struggled academically in school and just kind of need to repair their GPAs before going into a health profession. So, I have lots of experience with that as well as advising for all health professions at HPA. So, I always get really excited when I get a chance to do a presentation on the HPA side because it's kind of like a breath of fresh air for me. So, um, gonna kind of get right into it. Today we're going to be talking about secondary applications, and this is a part of the application process that tends to be quite time consuming. And the reason why I say that is because every school that you apply to, for the most part, for a lot of the different health professions that you'll see, there are going to be multiple questions that they're going to ask you once you've already sent in your primary because they want to learn a bit more about you. So, after you've sent in your primary application, which is comprised of your personal statement, your transcripts, letters of rec, kind of like those fundamental parts of your application, oftentimes schools will send you a secondary, which is another subset of questions to get to know you better. And they will ask many, many, many different types of questions. So being able to understand what the school is really trying to get at and how you can best position yourself to be competitive when submitting secondary applications back is kind of what we'll talk about today. I'm going to just hit to the next slide here if my computer works well. Great. Um, so again, talking a little bit about how secondaries work, you would have had to have already submitted a primary application to get a secondary application. And some schools, and I'll speak for a second about medical schools, some medical schools will send you a secondary that has like two questions. And these can be really short, 250 character responses. Then you have other schools who will send you 10 questions in their secondary, and each of the questions might be two paragraphs of a response that they want. So when I say that it's time consuming, it really can be, depending on how many schools you're applying to. Now, the average amount of schools that a pre-medical student would apply to is somewhere around 20 to 25, maybe 30, which is a lot. I know that's a lot, but that's typical for medical school. But for PA school, dental school, nursing school, vet school, we're looking at more like 6 to 10. It's a much smaller number. So managing secondaries tends to be a little bit better for um, other health professions outside of medicine. However, you still want to make sure your secondaries are very well written. You're coming to advisors to seek help and kind of get guidance on your writing. And most importantly, you're answering the question. I think that is the biggest thing I see with advising, especially over the years with students in secondaries, is you may have something that you want to say to the admissions committee that you've been like just finding somewhere that you could like get out this story or this piece of information you want to share. You may really want it to fit in a particular secondary, but if you're not answering that direct question they're asking, that is kind of the main thing that can prevent students from being as successful in a cycle. So really, really making sure you're answering their questions. And we will definitely we'll go through some examples today of some types of questions that tend to pop up. So first and foremost, when we're thinking about secondaries, you want to be really, really organized. I always encourage students to have a Google Sheet and list every single school that you have applied to or are planning on applying to in the Google Sheet. And within this sheet, you also want to have just some general research you've done about the school. So maybe like what kind of curriculum they have, where they're located, what city, some of the characteristics of that city. So maybe if you're like applying to a school in New York and it's in a pretty urban area, just kind of putting that in this document so you know the type of community that you're going to be serving. Um, Also, in terms of ethnic background and cultural background, are you going to be in an area where the patients are predominantly Spanish speaking? Are there other language barriers? Are there food deserts where patients are struggling to find healthy food options? Like, you really want to learn about each and every school you apply to. And I can't stress this enough. we do other app prep sessions on building a school list, but it's really, really important you're intimately uh, involved with, understanding the school you're applying to. That is really how students get a lot of interviews after submitting secondaries, is that secondary was so tailored to that school that the school knew how much you knew about their school. That's really what they're looking at here. So the more you know about the school, the stronger your secondary is going to be. You want to avoid sending really generic secondary responses that you can kind of like copy and paste and just send to a bunch of schools. You always want to tailor it for the school that you're trying to get into, which takes extra time. But that's why, we want you all to just be really prepared and recognize how much time that you do kind of want to put into this when the time comes. Other things you can write down in your Google Sheet would be student organizations that they have, and some researchers. Are there any like groundbreaking research that's being done at that school? Or maybe it's not like the most groundbreaking, but maybe an undergrad, you studied cancer biology, and you did some research in a cancer lab. If there happens to be a researcher at this particular school you're applying to who's also studying similar things in cancer that you did, you could put that in your secondary and say, like, what draws me to your program is that Dr. Feinstein has a lab studying these particular cancer markers, and I've already had a lot of experience with that in undergrad or in my post-grad life. So being able to continue those efforts at your program would further strengthen my ability to blah, 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 right? So I'm just kind of spitballing here, but you want to show these schools, who's actually at their school, what organizations they have, what communities they're serving, because you're going to stand out amongst all the other students who are applying, who are giving really generic responses. The worst thing you can do is give a very generic response in secondary. So remember that. Okay. Um, any questions so far before I keep going on? We're good? Okay. Well, feel free to interrupt me anytime. Okay. Um, in a column on this same Google Doc, once you've made these different columns for, again, curriculum, location, all of that, you're going to add another column that actually has a link to the Google Doc for the secondary. So let's say I'm applying to 5 schools. And again, we'll use medical school as an example. Let's say I'm applying to 5 medical schools, and I've applied to UC Davis School of Medicine, and I've just gotten their secondary. I'm going to create a separate Google Doc just to work on that secondary and put that link into the actual Excel spreadsheet. So I have everything all in one place. Or some students have all of their secondaries in one document, which is probably a bit more efficient. Just make sure you link your secondaries document somewhere into this Google Doc if you don't want to do it like column by column. But you just want to stay really, really organized and know where everything is, especially usernames and passwords. I cannot stress how big of a deal this has been over the years. The students who have made accounts within within the portals for some of these schools. And if you don't remember your login to the portal for the UC Davis secondary or the UCLA secondary, you're going to have to deal with all the issues of like forgot your password, and like sometimes those systems aren't always the most reliable. So any passwords or usernames that you need for a secondary, please, please, please save it in this one big Excel file and have a color coding system. So we'll get to that in the next slide about how to color code, but you're mostly going to be color coding for what kind of secondary is it? Is it a secondary that we deem easy, which is just a simple one question answer, or sorry, uh, one question secondary where you can just quickly answer that question and hurry up and send it in? Is it something that's more like medium, where you do have to kind of really do some thinking? You might have some content elsewhere you can kind of tweak, but it still requires a certain level of thinking to produce a decent response. Or is it hard? Like you have no idea where to begin. You have no content that you can use to tweak. You've got to just start from scratch and really dig in and write. So those are the ways you're going to kind of want to color code. And you really want to make sure when you get a secondary invite, you look at it. Some students will get the email and say, okay, I got a secondary from UC Davis. I know that it's there. When I'm ready to work on that one, I'll go look at it. Don't do that. look at it as soon as you get it, because again, it could just be a simple question. It might just be a multiple choice question, and you just click the answer you think is best and you're done. What you don't want to do is have a secondary come in that is really easy to answer and you never open the email and you notice that, and it takes you 3 weeks to send it in because the school is going to be like, we only had one question, right? Like, why did it take the student 3 weeks to turn it in? So the rule of thumb with secondary submissions is you ideally want to submit your secondary within 2 weeks of receiving it, which is a very tight time frame. So again, being organized, having the amount of time to write is really helpful. Most schools will give you about a month to turn it in. They'll give you their own deadline, but you really do want to try to get it in within 2 weeks because that shows the school you cared, they were a priority to you, and you sent them something that was very well written without having to make them wait for too long. So again, always open your emails, always look at what the secondary is asking you for. And if it's quick, just do it and turn it in. That way the turnaround time is really good. So again, I was kind of just talking about this strategy for submitting. Um Easy again, already you either have something already pre-written, um, you don't have to really think as much about it. Medium is like half recyclable content, half new content, and difficult is like we've got to just kind of start from scratch and get it going. Um, I also want to say that if you're applying to a lot of schools, again, like let's use med school as an example, and you're applying to like 25 schools, once you've done about 10 secondaries, you are going to have a lot of reusable content. So secondaries do get easier the further into secondary season you get. It's usually just the hardest in the beginning because you're like coming up with new things. But a lot of schools do have very similar questions. A lot of schools will ask about a difficult challenge you face. A lot of schools will ask about times you've had conflict with a colleague or a superior and how you handled it. They may ask you why you think that you're a good fit for their school. So some things like are very much reusable, and it's helpful for you because again, you're not having to deal with so much of the brand new secondary stuff. Um, Sorry, let me move my mouse here. Um, and so after you list your secondaries from easiest to most difficult, you kind of have the color coding system. You're going to group them by the most similar questions. And so again, if I've looked at all my schools and 10 schools are asking me, what is the biggest challenge you face and how did you overcome it? Well, 10 is a lot. So I'm probably going to work on that question first because that question is going to help me answer 10 different schools at the same time. So that's kind of what you want to do. You're trying to figure out like the best plan to divide and conquer your time. So answering questions again that are very similar to each other at the same time will help you work your way through your secondaries faster than necessarily just like doing one secondary at a time. So I'll do Davis first, then I'll do UCLA, then I'll do UC Irvine. That does work for some students, don't get me wrong. But I've seen historically it's a little bit better when you're grouping questions, knocking them all out, and trying to kind of keep on a nice time frame there. And again, I can't stress this enough. If it's going to take you less than 15 minutes to do it and submit it right away. All right. Okay. I think my mouse is mad at me again. Okay, here we go. So the goal is making a strong connection to the schools by showing them you want to be there. Now, showing them you want to be there is more than just saying, it's been my dream to go to this school and I'm so excited and I've always wanted to stay near my family and go to school in California. Like, you want to avoid the more cliche, general or kind of like generic responses here. You need to tell them like why you want to be there. So again, going back to our example of research, if you know that you want to do research in cancer, even like further into your career, you having a mentor, a researcher who's at your particular PA school or dental school or med school, um, having them there to mentor you and guide you through this process is invaluable. So saying things like, I want to be here because I know I'll be able to foster the relationships that will get me to where I aspire to be as a practitioner or further develop myself in these particular areas. So be very, very specific when you say you want to be there. It's not just about the fact that you want to be there, it's about why you want to be there and why UC Irvine in particular, or why um, Wayne State School of Medicine in particular. Um, Number two, that you know them. I can't stress that part enough as well, right? We were talking earlier about student organizations that they have, calling those out. If you did a student-run clinic in undergrad, mention the student-run clinics that you were able to find that maybe they have at that dental school or that vet school or med school. Call it out by name, because that's going to show them that you've done your research and you've done your homework. So anytime you say, my kind of rule I try to give my students, anytime you say you want to do something, back it up with specific evidence of why you want to do it that you've kind of done in your past. So if I say, well, I really want to have some early clinical exposure and make sure I'm able to engage with patients, as early as year one in my training. I would say that because I got a chance to be in a student-run clinic when I was an undergrad, and I got a chance to have that early clinical exposure, and I saw how further along that put me. So I know that having the early clinical exposure is something that will allow me to continue cultivating certain skill sets and become, a very strong physician leader, blah, blah, blah. So um, you need to know that you want to be there and that you know who they are and that you can bring value to them. Confidence is very, very important. And there's a difference between confidence and cockiness. We know that no one necessarily strives to be cocky, but sometimes it can come across as that. So you want to be very matter of fact, but still have like a softness to it at the same time. So letting them know that when you worked in a student run clinic, here's an example, letting them know that when you worked in a student-run clinic, you worked with a lot of patients who struggled with some language barriers, and you were able to either help them navigate that or bring in a translator to help make that process a bit more smooth. So when we're talking about value to the school, you can say, because of my experience working with patients who have those language barriers, and I've been able to help them overcome and navigate some of these healthcare complexities, I know that when I come to your program, I know that you have a high population of Spanish speaking patients. And because of what I've done, I know that I'd be able to be really efficient and really effective in your community at if I were to, um, attend this school or attend this medical school. So letting them know what you can do for their community and how you can be effective and efficient is what they're going to want to see in your secondaries. If you just give them that backstory, but don't tell them how you plan to be effective, you're assuming that they're going to take your, you're assuming that they're going to just understand, but you have to like spell it out for them. They want it to be very clear. And number four, that you're a good fit. The mission statements for every school you can find on the websites. And a lot of mission statements actually sound pretty similar, but the more you learn about a school, the more you'll kind of understand their vibe. So for example, UC Davis School of Medicine is very focused on underserved communities, and they really want students who want to stay in Sacramento. If you put a lot in your secondaries about like wanting to go abroad or like wanting to take your training to other countries, it's not that that's not an amazing aspiration, but that those are not the students Davis is looking for. Davis wants students who want to stay in Sacramento and practice in Sacramento long term because they have disparities there. Whereas Tulane School of Medicine in New Orleans, they're designed to send students globally and make an impact on the world. So if you are saying to them, I just really want to serve the patients in New Orleans and I want to make sure I'm here long term and not talking about global medicine or global health, you're not the best fit for them. Doesn't mean that you weren't smart, doesn't mean that your grades weren't great or MCAT or any of that. It just means you weren't the best fit for them. So when you're putting your school list together, you really have to ask yourself, am I a good fit for this school based off of all the things that they talk about and all the programs they have and, student orgs and like things they're putting out on their socials? Like, does this vibe seem like it fits my experiences and my passions, because if it doesn't, your chances of getting into that school are pretty low, even if your metrics look good. In the same fashion, if there's a school that's typically known to be like really hard to get into, but you know you're a good fit for the school, maybe your grades or your metrics aren't as high, but if you're a good fit, they're going to look at you because they need students who are a good fit for their school. So be very strategic in where you apply. Please don't just apply to all the schools you've heard of before or all the schools your friends have applied to. Like do your own research. Make sure you're a good fit. And that takes time. As I said, we have other app prep sessions on like building a school list. That's something I probably talk about the most in my advising over the years is crafting the right school list. Um, you can have a school list of 30 schools for med school on there, and maybe only 6 or 7 are actually schools you're a good fit for. And I see that a lot as to why some students maybe don't get in. It's oftentimes not because they weren't strong candidates, they just chose the wrong schools. And when they redo the school list the next time, they're getting multiple offers, multiple acceptances, all of that. So be mindful of your school list. Um, okay, let's go back here. Any questions so far? I feel like I've been talking for a while. Still good? Okay, great. Um, why is your perspective needed at the table? This is just a really good question. I want you all to just kind of ponder and think about as you're heading towards applying to health professional programs. You kind of want to know like what's your edge? Um, what is the unique perspective that you bring to the table? Were you a first generation college student who didn't know how to navigate the system and found a way to persevere and make it and now you can kind of relate to others in the same case? Were you first generation American where you had to navigate um, immigration situations, language barriers? Like, where is your corner of the world where you just really understand it? And maybe others don't have as much perspective on it, and you'd like to kind of stretch that and grow that. That's what I want you all to think about. It doesn't mean you have to have this like traumatic story or like some monumental thing. It's just what perspectives do you bring that are a little bit different or unique? I have some students who grew up in foster care who kind of talk about that. I have some students who actually had very, very privileged lives, but spent some time in some more underserved areas and gained some perspective. And now they can kind of speak about that. Um, I have some students who grew up and like they had a parent who was hearing impaired. Doesn't always have to be about culture or race or things like that, but just think about, you know, what perspectives you bring and try to write those down because you kind of want to talk from that perspective in a lot of your secondaries. So it kind of has one solid voice and it's consistent. All right. So let's actually look at some examples of secondaries and kind of talk through my thoughts on how to attack these, how to answer these, and then I'll have some time for Q&A at the end. But the diversity question is definitely the question that I feel like stresses students out the most because a lot of students feel like they don't offer any substantial diversity, and all of you do. I don't care what background you're from. I don't care, what you've been through in life. Each and every one of you has um some aspect of diversity. You're you. There's no one else like you. So we just have to kind of figure out what that is and try to put it into words. But here are some examples of diversity questions that some schools have asked in the past. So you can see how the first one, I'll just jump to the second sentence. Please describe your personal characteristics that would add to the educational experience of others. So maybe I would talk about being an African American student, having to navigate predominantly white institutions has informed me, in a lot of different ways. And maybe I can talk about some of those experiences and how those have manifested in other areas of my extracurriculars and how I strive to be someone who can continue to bring this perspective forward in my healthcare spaces. So that's just one thing, right? But again, it doesn't have to be about race. It can be about family dynamics. It can be about just any personal things you've gone through, um, things you've experienced with parents, like whatever it is. Just ask yourself, like, what are some of those personal characteristics you have that would add to a collective, that would bring that extra perspective? That's what we want. University of Arizona has a diversity question in their secondary where it's just worded a little bit differently. It says celebrates the differences, talents, and unique qualities of all individuals. Describe how you will pursue inclusive excellence in your studies while contributing to the collaborative environment. So here they do want you to talk about what are your diverse perspectives that you have, but not only that, how will you foster inclusion? How will you foster other people who think differently than you, who have different perspectives? And the only way you all can really answer these questions well is by providing examples. So it's one thing for me to say, well, I know I'm going to be able to be inclusive because I believe in inclusivity and I think it makes the world better and blah, blah, blah. But that's not as good as saying, well, I know that I'll be able to foster inclusive excellence in my studies because when I was working as an EMT, I worked on a team of 7, and we all came from very different backgrounds. We had different communication styles, but we found a way to work together and maybe even give like a specific patient example of when you all actually had to come together. You had differing opinions, but you found a way to make it work. You always want to back up you always want to put specific examples in your secondaries if you can. Sometimes the character count will limit you, so you can't really do as much of it. But if you have enough character count where you can at least type a paragraph, please make sure that paragraph is a specific example. And there's like 3 things you want in a secondary. And the structure of that would be that you actually answer the question first. So that earlier in the presentation, I was talking about making sure you answer the question. Here's where that really comes into play. So if the question said, please describe how you will pursue inclusive excellence in your studies, you actually want to start off your answer by saying, I would pursue inclusive excellence in my studies by, like, you literally want to answer that question first. You don't want the person to have to go and hunt for the answer who's reading it. So like, don't just start with the story. Make sure there's a introduction into the story by answering the question. So answer the question, back it up with some evidence with the story, and then end it with the relevance. Why was this story important? And again, how is it gonna how do you plan to use this to impact, your future moving forward? So again, my 3-step approach is answer the question directly that's being asked, back it up with a scenario or a story that actually happened, and then wrap it up and kind of just tie it into your future, or tie it into, how you would continue to foster this level of inclusivity. All right. I can't remember which school of medicine this last one was from. Here's just another way of asking the diversity question. It says, please write about things in your background that have been important to your development or have been challenging to you on your path. This can include socioeconomic status, culture, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. So all of these things, and explain how they have influenced your goals and preparation for a career in medicine. So pretty long-winded, but still getting at the same idea. Give them your unique perspectives. Give them like a specific example if you can, like, tell a story, paint the picture a little bit, and then explain how that has influenced your goals and preparation. So they kind of actually made the outline a little bit easier for you here. But all of these questions are asking the same thing. It's just about it's about learning how to interpret what they're asking. And as you get deeper into secondary writing, you'll start to ask yourself, okay, what kind of question is this? Is this a diversity question? Is this a question about teamwork? This is a question about integrity? Because they're all going to be worded very differently, but you're trying to get at the root of what they're asking. And that's when you can start to sort of use some content from like other secondaries you've already worked on and say, okay, well, I already wrote a secondary for UC Riverside about challenges I face. So I could just take some of that and then tweak it for this new school and put in some really specific things about this new school So it still feels like a fresh entry. Okay. Um, this is actually one of the secondary questions for, I believe this is California North State, because that's the medical school that we have here in Sacramento and Elk Grove. And this says, how's your involvement with diverse populations prepared you for potentially 4 years in Elk Grove, which is the greater Sacramento area and the rest of the Central Valley? Still a diversity question, even though it's asking you about your involvement with diverse populations. So they are going to obviously want you to talk about your involvement with diverse populations, but if if you're able to share your own diverse perspectives too, I would absolutely encourage that. What I like about this entry, I'll let you read it for maybe like 15 seconds. Um, what I like about this entry though is that you can tell that this person did not come from a low income background. They did not come from an under-resourced community. They actually had a pretty good life, which is always a good thing. But I felt like they framed this in a way that allowed them to like check their privilege, but still understand that there's a lot that they had to learn and kind of had that nice moment of understanding. So I'll pause for a second and let you read it, and then I'll come back and finish. Okay. It's okay we didn't finish reading, but I just wanted to point out here that you can see when the student answered the question. So the question specifically said, how has your involvement with diverse populations prepared you? You can see how the student immediately goes into involvement. They start talking about volunteering for Imani Clinic, and they talk about the clinic and kind of the makeup of the clinic. Then they go into a very specific example about Sarah and what they took away from that and how they saw that to be a very relevant experience in their life. They then talked about Sam, same thing. Why was it important and what did it teach you? The student said that these experiences taught me to never make judgments or assumptions about others. Everyone has their own story, but sharing that is up to them. And I liked again how this student said, they grew up privileged in Irvine, and you should never be ashamed about uh growing up privileged. That's an amazing thing. And I see a lot of students sometimes struggling with their writing because they'll say like, I didn't have a hard life and I don't have this crazy story. You don't have to. It's great that things went well. The question is, now that you know that, how did you go out and help, right? How did you go and try to make things better for others considering the privilege that you did have? And that's all we're asking for typically with application writing is just you know, how did you go out and make an impact and make a difference? So, but that was a pretty well written secondary. Adversity questions. These are very popular. Tell us about a time you failed at something. Tell us about any challenges you faced in your journey to medicine. Describe any adversity you faced and how did you overcome it. These are really, really common questions that you'll see in just pretty much every secondary. I won't say every secondary, but a lot of them you will see these questions. Again, you want to use that same approach I had before. Answer the question. So tell them what it was that you failed at or what the challenge was. Then go into a story where you can be very specific about it. Paint the picture, give us some details, tell us what happened, tell us what you did and how you persevered. And then finally, why is this relevant? Why is this important? How is this going to help you on your journey into your intended health profession moving forward? It's that same three-step approach. And you'll also learn for interviewing, it's the same thing. When someone asks you an interview question, you want to answer their question directly, back it up with evidence, and then tie that into your future in medicine. So it's the same kind of cadence throughout the entire cycle of how you're supposed to approach these questions. It's not designed to like trick you or be like weird. It really is straightforward. But success comes from specificity. You have to be very specific with your stories, with your conclusions, and when you're projecting forward, how you hope to make change or what change you expect to make having gone through some of these experiences. UC San Diego School of Medicine and Vanderbilt. I always just put this in there because they don't actually have typical secondaries. They just have write an autobiography. And it's long. It's like 4 or 5 pages. So they literally just want you to write out your life story. So that can be fun for some. It's not fun for most, but just giving you an idea of like how different some of these secondary questions can be. Um, I've seen secondary questions about like if you can give yourself a nickname, what would it be? If you could be an animal, what would it be and why? Um, Pick a color and then associate the color to a competency and why you think that makes sense. Like I've seen a lot of weird secondaries over the years. So some of these questions are really just meant to be fun. They're just trying to get a sense of your personality and they're trying to see um, how you respond to questions you might not be used to getting. And yeah, that kind of just tells them a little bit more about you. So writing an autobiography is definitely a secondary that a lot of my students write because a lot do apply to UC San Diego. So just to be mindful of that is helpful. And this is kind of my last slide here. Here's some real examples. Some other ones that I was talking about. Briefly describe your single most rewarding experience. Are there any areas of medicine that are of particular interest to you? If so, comment. Can you pick one nickname? That's the one I said. That's actually USC, School of Medicine, picking a nickname for yourself. So ultimately, you can get secondary questions that ask you anything. The goal is to try to still make sure your personality's in there. You're answering the questions, you're giving evidence and telling like a nice little story. Then you're wrapping it up with relevance and you're submitting timely secondaries. Very important. Please get your secondaries in within 2 weeks if you can. 3 weeks if you're like kind of running behind, it makes sense. But try not to let them go out a month or beyond that even if the deadline still says it's okay, don't trust it. They want you to submit sooner. Always open your secondary emails first to see what the question is. If it's short, just go ahead and submit it. Don't sit on it. So I would say those are kind of my main tips here. I'm gonna stop screen sharing and just see if there's any questions about secondaries that maybe came up while I was presenting the slides. I'm happy to stick around for a bit and answer any questions. And if you're all good, that is okay too. All right. Well, I'll hang out for a few minutes still. If any questions pop up and you want to just type them in the chat or unmute, totally fine. If not, thanks so much for joining me today. This recording will be posted as well if you want to rewatch. And for those students who aren't able to join today, it'll be posted on the HPA site. But thanks for joining me. Hope you have a good one.